Well, good morning. We are in 1 Corinthians 10, and we'll do our best today in looking at idolatry and things that are expedient. The first thing, we want to kind of go back and to verse 14 of 1 Corinthians 10, which talks about idolatry, and that was a major problem in the city of Corinth. Corinth was just given over to idols of all kinds. And so it was a problem in the church in Corinth too. Certainly some of the Gentiles in the church came out of idolatry, idolatrous families. And so no doubt they had issues that had to be resolved. So I want to start in verse 18 and kind of review a little bit of last week. Verse 18 says, "Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers, partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything?" And of course, those are rhetorical questions with negative answers expected. So Paul is using some examples from Israel's past. Of course, he had done that in the first part of chapter 10 as well. And he's making a point that you can't separate what's on the altar from the sacrifice. I mean, they're all connected, he says. And that's what he means in verse 18. They're connected together. All of it is. And of course, like always, we have to take into consideration the context and what he's already talked about to the church there. So it is what we have to be concerned about. And so he says, is an idol anything? No, it's not. Because an idol isn't real. I mean, he's already talked about that once. Idols are false. They're not real. There's no real God behind the idols at all. They're not real in any sense. And what is offered to idols anything? No, they're not anything either, because those sacrifices are being made to something, good morning, that doesn't exist. And so that's why he's giving us rhetorical questions in verse 19. None of that is real. The idols were nothing. The animals that were sacrificed on it were nothing. And so eating of meat that was sacrificed to idols isn't anything inherently wrong. Now, the situation could make it wrong, but the meat itself, he says, is not, you don't sin by just eating this meat. You have to be careful, though, about the context, about the situation, about the circumstances, because you have to be concerned about other people. So where you eat the sacrifice might be important. And the people that you're eating the sacrifice in front of, you have to be careful about. But the actual sacrifice itself, he says, the actual meat itself, it's not morally corrupt in any way. So he says, verse 20, rather that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. See, those aren't real. That's what he's saying here. He says, I don't want you to have fellowship with demons. He'd already talked about, and I think he's going to mention again, you cannot go into, if you're living in the city of Corinth, go into a pagan god's temple and worship there and make sacrifices there and think that it's all right. He says, no, it is not all right. Understanding that the Gentiles, and there were people from the Gentile background who were in the church in Corinth, So understand that the Gentiles, pagans in this case, what they sacrifice, they're not really sacrificing to God because they're sacrificing to these false gods. That's what he says. So he says, I don't want you to have any fellowship with demons. And certainly if someone saw you in a pagan temple and making sacrifices or eating sacrifices from the altar, what are they going to think? That you think it's good, that it's real, that what you're doing is a real thing. And so he says, I don't want you to have any fellowship. Again, going back to the situation, you have to be careful as Christians about where you go, what you do, what you say, what you eat, what you drink. You have to be careful. And really that's what he's talking about the rest of the chapter, is you have to be careful about the situation. You have to be careful about the circumstances. He didn't want any of the Christians in the church at Corinth to be thought of as idol worshipers. And he's going to continue with that. He says, verse 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. You know, he had just talked about the Lord's Supper back in verses, 16 and 17. So he says, you have to, it's kind of like you cannot serve God and mammon. You have to make up your mind about what you're going to serve. You're going to serve demons? Because if you go into a pagan temple and sacrifice or eat of the sacrifices, you're eating at the table of demons. Yeah, the meat that's sacrificed, the meat itself isn't morally corrupt, but you eating it there in the pagan temple would make it sinful. So that's why he's so careful about telling these people, who are you really serving? So if a Christian, attended one of these sacrificial feasts in the pagan temple, he became a joint participant. He would be worshiping idols. So he says that's why you have to stay away from it. Very, very careful to stay away from it. So he ends that little section by saying, or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? And of course, again, we are talking about rhetorical questions. You don't want to provoke the Lord to wrath by going into a pagan temple and sacrificing or eating the meat there in the temple, because God says you cannot serve God and mammon. It goes back to the original 10 Commandments. You're only supposed to serve God, no one else. So, that's certainly the choice people have to make. That's the choice they had to make back then. Who are you going to serve? You're going to serve the Lord? You're going to serve these false gods? You have to make up your mind. Don't serve God half-heartedly. Don't just serve him on Sunday. That's what he's saying. Don't just serve him on Sunday. You make up your mind. God says you can't share me with something else. All right, that's the point of verse 22. How many times does the Bible say God's a jealous God? Over and over and over again. Old and New Testament. The book of Hebrews talks about it in the New Testament. You cannot serve both. People have to make up their mind. Well, I'll serve God on Sunday and maybe one other day during the week, but then the rest of the time I'm going to serve myself or serve demons. No. God says, can't do it. Make up your mind. Okay. So again, he's talking about the situation and circumstances and who you're with and where you're with. He says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. So it's okay to murder people? Well, of course not. Again, you have to take context and everything he said. Everything that's lawful, Paul could do. But that doesn't mean he should. You know, going back a couple of chapters, he could have taken money from the Corinthian church to support himself. But he chose not to. See, that was lawful. It was lawful for him to take money from the church at Corinth. But he knew if he did, it wouldn't be expedient. And we talked about why, because there would be people there that said, oh, well, the only reason you're here is to get money. Paul took money from all kinds of other churches, but he wouldn't take it from the church at Corinth. There's an example of what Paul was talking about. It was lawful for him to do it, but it wasn't a good idea. It could cause more harm than good. So he says that wouldn't be helpful. So he's not saying, he's using, a figure of speech called hyperbole. All things are lawful for me. No, they're not. But the idea is everything that's lawful, I'm allowed to do, but that doesn't mean I should do it. Just because it's the right thing or just because it's okay or right, doesn't mean you should do it. All right? Doesn't mean you should do it. Again, consider the circumstances. Who you're with, where you're with, what you're doing. A Christian has to always be thinking about his example. So Paul said, I'm not going to take money from the church at Corinth because that's going to be a bad example. It was perfectly fine for me to do it, but he says, I'm not going to in that case. Just like today, maybe if I had a Jewish student in class last year. Didn't know about it for a long time, but I found out later he was Jewish. But, if I had pork to eat, I don't know how Jewish he was, but assuming he was real strict, then it was lawful for me to eat pork, but it wouldn't have been a good idea to eat it in front of him. And Paul's going to say the same thing here. He says, think about the situation. Yeah, it's lawful. You can do it. But is it something you should do in that case? So he says, yeah, these things are lawful, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be helpful or edify. He uses the word edify. And it wouldn't be. So he says, again, that's one of the battles Christians have to face. People in the world don't care. But we have to care. We have to care about other people around us and, who we're with and so forth. So he said, let no one seek his own, and there he gets to the real heart of the issue. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. That's what you have to think about, other people. That's what he comes down to. Think about other people. What are they going to think about what you're doing? Now, there are cases, and he's going to talk about that here in a minute too, there are cases where what if coming to church this morning offended Seventh-day Adventists? Well, I still have to come to church today. So in some cases, it's too bad they get offended, okay? Because this is something I have to do. But if there is something you don't have to do, don't do it and offend somebody. So, and Paul's going to talk about both cases. He says sometimes you have to offend people. And sometimes that's okay if they're offended. If you're doing something that you must do, that's lawful, that you have to do, then if they get offended, they have to deal with it, not you. But when you can not offend someone, then that's great. So, he says, be careful about that. Be concerned about other people. So eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Again, he's talking about the situation. The meat itself is not morally wrong or corrupt or sinful. It's just meat. All right? It's just meat. Don't eat it in front of somebody that's going to be offended because you're eating it, because that's not edifying. Because why? You don't have to eat the meat. Now, if God told you you had to eat the meat, that would be different. You'd have to go ahead and eat it. But eating the meat or not eating the meat, it doesn't matter one way or the other. But why eat it in front of someone that believes it's wrong because it was sacrificed to an idol? Why do it? And he's already talked about that a couple of chapters back. Because this was a big issue in Corinth, idolatry. When we get to chapter 11, he talks about head coverings. Still talking about idolatry. It's still this subject. It's all about idolatry here in these chapters, or in this middle section. So he says, eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. That word meat market here, if you have a King James, you'll see the word shambles. And that goes back many, many centuries. You know, when someone their life is kind of a wreck, what do we say? Well, man, their life's in shambles. Well, it goes back to this word. All right, that's the idea. It started out as shambles was like the tables where this meat was set out. And then over time, that word shambles came to mean something more destructive. And of course, now we think about it as being a wreck or something really bad. So it's kind of one of those words that's changed meaning somewhat from what it was originally a long time ago. But so if you're going to the meat market, like if I was going to Walmart to buy meat, and some of it might have been processed by an atheist. Why? That doesn't matter. I don't care about that at all. That's what Paul said. It doesn't matter. There's nothing wrong with the meat itself. There's something wrong with the atheist, but there's nothing wrong with the meat itself. But again, if someone else, thinks that meat is morally corrupt because it came from an atheist, I shouldn't eat it in front of them. Okay? Why? Because I don't have to eat the meat. I can wait some other time to eat the meat because there's nothing wrong with eating the meat. So it's just all about the situation, where you are, who you're with, the people. You always have to be concerned about other people and what they're thinking, okay? So he says, don't ask questions when you're going. Of course, I wouldn't ever go to Walmart, pick out meat and say, where did this meat come from? Did an atheist touch it at any point in time? Well, I mean, that would be ridiculous anyway. But the point is, just don't be concerned about that. All right? There are times where you need to be concerned, like if you were in Corinth, and the situation, just like with head coverings. It's going to be a situation that you have to be concerned about. Those head coverings was associated with what? Idolatry. At least it was in Corinth in the first century. So there are situations that arise where you have to be aware of these things. So, for the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. God gave us all those things. God's the provider of all that. Of course, we should be, thankful for it, because that meat, ultimately, it came from God. All right, it came from God. He provided. So again, it's not morally contaminated in any way. But he says, if any of those who do not believe, okay, so now, here's some of the situations he's talking about. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. So if you go and, unbelievers ask you and you've got some meat there, do not be concerned if it was sacrificed to idols. So what if it was? Well, it's not sinful. It's not contaminated. So eat whatever is before you. Asking no question for conscience sake. It doesn't matter. But, he says, here's a different situation. Verse 28, but if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, well, see, that changes everything. If you were in Corinth in the first century, that changed everything. Do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Be concerned about the other person, going back to some of those prior verses. Be concerned about the other person. Now that person could be, and of course we don't know from the context, that other person could be testing him. Let's see what he's going to do with this meat. And of course we can't tell from what Paul wrote which of those situations he's talking about. But either way, be concerned about the other person. Be concerned about, what they're thinking or whatever. And as long as you're not going against God, and this goes back to that point, again, if someone is offended or whatever about us coming to church on Sunday, that's their problem. I don't want to offend God by not coming to church, but that other person's going to have to deal with it. They think you're supposed to worship on Saturday. Well, we know better. So we come to church anyway on Sunday because we're supposed to. And if that offends people out in the world, well, they're just going to be offended, and it's not any problem with us. We don't have to worry about that. But like if it's eating meat, I can choose to eat meat or I can choose to eat something else. I can eat potatoes instead. It's not that I have to eat meat. It's nothing I have to do. So he says, conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? So I don't want to do anything, again, to encourage someone else to do something wrong. I never want to do that. So, again, it's about the other person, and when you can refrain from doing something to keep something from being offended, fine. But make sure that you're not offending God, because that's the one person you never ever want to offend. You always want to do what he tells you to do. And if doing that offends someone else, that's their problem. They have to deal with it. All right? You never want to offend God. So he says, he talks about my liberty. Paul had the right to eat that meat. It wasn't morally contaminated. But he certainly didn't want to hurt someone else's conscience when he didn't have to eat the meat. Again, that's the lawful and not edifying. But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? Therefore, here's the conclusion. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God, because that's the most important thing. Everything you do, everything you say, everything you eat, or everything you drink, make sure it's done so that God is in some way glorified. And if Paul was going to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and he was doing that in front of someone that thought it was wrong, that wasn't glorifying God. That wasn't glorifying God at all. So he said, make sure, again, there's the conclusion. Therefore, whatever you do, doesn't make any difference. He says, whatever you do, make sure you do it to the glory of God. He says that is what is so very, very, very important. He says, give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. Again, if by restraining or refraining from eating that meat sacrificed to idols, if that's going to help, then okay. I can eat that by myself at home if I want to. So if there's a way to not give offense, great. just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. There's ultimately what you want. If not eating meat sacrificed to idols will help that person and then possibly lead them to becoming a Christian, wonderful. That's fantastic. And that's what he wants. He says, always put God first, and then put other people in front of you. Put other people in front of you. And, you know, that's what love is all about, is doing what's best for other people. Okay, I'm not going to eat this meat sacrificed to idols in front of these people because I want what's best for them. I want what's best for them. Always remembering that I have to put God first, though, regardless. So it's a tremendously relevant section of 1 Corinthians. But again, he's going to continue this. You know, there were no chapter or verse divisions in the first century. So when he started talking about head coverings, he's still talking about idolatry and bringing glory to God and all of that. Still the same subject, Lord willing. We'll get to that next week.